pray with me? Loving God, over the many years since people tried to write down an account of what Jesus said and did and what it all meant, there's been a lot of points of view about it. As many as there have been people reading, I reckon. But loving God, you have one message for us, and that message is love. And there was one Jesus, and we try to come close to him. I pray that through the words I say tonight, somehow that one message and that one Jesus can shine through. Amen.
Amen.
So, because people asked for, at the sort of planning meeting we had, of a sort of general overview of the Gospels, I am preaching tonight on the whole of Matthew. Yeah, so did anyone bring a pillow? Settle down. It is hard to talk about, an entire Gospel as your texts without turning it into an academic lecture. I'm going to do my best not to do that. Bear with me if you know some of this background. I'm just going to skim through a bit of it. There's 4 Gospels. One Jesus who had one life, and Matthew's one of the 3 we call the synoptics. And there's this thing, and they call it the synoptic problem, but from the point of view of looking at Matthew tonight, the issue is that pretty much the whole of Mark's Gospel is in Matthew's Gospel. Almost word for word in a lot of places, and more or less in the same order. And then there's some extra bits, some of which are also found in Luke, some of which are only found in Matthew. And some of, people have come up with theories as to why this might be over the years, and they varied, but recently consensus is that when Matthew sat down to write his Gospel, he had Mark's in front of him, plus various other sources, some of which Luke also had. And there's lots of argument, and people have tried to reconstruct all these other sources, but frankly, I think that's a bit of a waste of time. What we've got is the Gospel according to Matthew, and that's what we've got to work with. That's what the message is that we're looking at. So Matthew mostly added a bunch of what Jesus said to what Mark had written down, because Mark zooms through the action. There's a wonderful storyline to it. But Matthew, and he says, Jesus taught with authority, not like the scribes, but he rarely ever says what Jesus taught with authority. And Matthew clearly thought, right, we've got to put some of that in. Does kind of spoil the flow of the storyline a bit. If you really want a sense of like the storyline, go to Mark. But if you want big chunks of what Jesus said, then Matthew is a pretty good place to go for it. And of what is uniquely Matthew, as opposed to any of the other Gospels, there's more of references to the Hebrew Testaments. There's more reference to the prophets. There's a lot of stuff from Isaiah, whatever, that doesn't get mentioned elsewhere. Matthew clearly thinks it's massively important. And he puts in some of the stories of Jesus' birth. Not all of them. You get a totally different picture from Matthew than you do from Luke. The bare bones of it's the same. Mary had baby, Joseph, not the dad. But pretty upset about that. Angel tells him it's all right. But he puts in a genealogy that's slightly different in details, and he tells us about the visit of the Magi, which no one else does. And then he puts some more stuff after the resurrection, because Mark stops dead at the tomb's empty, and Matthew puts a bit more. But a lot of the rest of what he puts in is about really tying what he knows about Jesus into what he knows about the Torah and the prophets. And I reckon what makes the most sense out of that is the fact that we reckon, as far as we can tell, Matthew's Gospel is written down after the Romans have come in and obliterated Jerusalem. The temple is literally, I mean, Jesus was not kidding, not one stone left upon a stone. That's literally, they flattened the place. And they also banned Jews from going back into the city. That was it. No more Jerusalem, no more temple, and it was never built again. So I reckon you've got this Jewish community, like Matthew, of believers in Jesus struggling to make sense of what on earth has happened. Why have the prophets let them down like this? Why has God let them down like this? Why have the scriptures let them down? They said, God is your vindicator. They're not feeling very vindicated right now. So Matthew's putting a lot of effort into explaining that the prophets have not let them down. On the contrary, they were pointing to Jesus, and Jesus came. And that's how he makes sense of the fact, no, there is no more temple, but that's okay, because it's not needed anymore. You don't need to make temple sacrifices. God is with us in Jesus. You know, I reckon if he'd been talking purely to Gentiles, he wouldn't have needed to explain that, because although they had their own problems with the Romans, many of them, the destruction of Jerusalem wasn't one of them. And it wasn't the only solution being offered. Matthew's not only the most Jewish gospel, it's also been picked up as being actually quite an anti-Semitic gospel. At least that's how it's been read. They're reading it as Matthew, Christians, versus Jews, who he was having a get at. But to be honest, what it reads more like to me, if you see it in that context of after the destruction, is actually it's Jews following Jesus who've found one solution to explain what's gone wrong, versus another group, the followers of the Pharisees and what will become rabbinic Judaism, who have come up with a different solution to the problem. And as so often happens, having been heavily sat upon by the Roman authorities, they have a go at each other. Unfortunately, that's not the only time in history we see that happen. You've got a Roman power neither of them can fight, who at that point is pretty down on both of them, and actually doesn't distinguish at this point between them very much. It's going to, but it hasn't really made a solid distinction. And possibly, you know, if the followers of Jesus hadn't realised that the message was to be opened up to Gentiles and everyone else, maybe the Rabbi Jesus of Nazareth would now just be another rabbi of Talmudic Judaism, like Gamaliel. But they didn't. They realised that the message was for all human beings, and thus, you know, it spread far, far from its roots in Israel. And, you know, eventually Christians aligned themselves with the power which changed the course of everything, but I'm not going into that right now. When Matthew writes, they're a small marginalised group amongst other small marginalised groups underneath a fairly solidly oppressive power. And Matthew's concerned that they remain a group, not scattered followers here and there, vulnerable to attack wherever they go, but a church, because the other thing about Matthew is he's the only gospel that speaks of the church, the ecclesia, the gathering of the people. And I think actually that's significant, that Matthew's really keen in the teaching that he puts forward to help them remain a community, to help them hang on in there together. And so he talks a lot of it, there's a lot of it in the Sermon on the Mount, but it's in the other blocks of teaching as well. He speaks of reconciliation a lot. He adds the merciful and the peacemakers to the Beatitudes. It's not in the other version. He speaks of not taking revenge, of not taking an eye for an eye. He speaks a lot about being reconciled to your brother in more than one place. He talks a lot about not judging. He talks a lot about forgiveness. You know, how many times should I forgive my brother? 7 times? No. 70 times 7 or 77 times. Differs in different versions. And the parable about the debtor who's forgiven, and how that forgiveness ought therefore to be handed on to those who owe to us in any way. There's a lot of it in there, and a lot about, you know, how we should be as servants to one another, not to lord it over each other or to seek power, but in order to seek how we can serve one another. It's all about the ecclesia, the gathered people of Jesus, treating each other gently and being willing to forgive, to give that little bit of elasticity in, you know, maybe somebody does something and I think it's definitely wrong. But that doesn't mean they've stopped being my family in Christ. Nor does it mean that we aren't still both part of the church. Nor does it mean we can't serve God together. It certainly doesn't mean I can't forgive them if it was something against me. It certainly doesn't mean that it destroys everything else they ever did or will do. And it certainly doesn't mean that they can't change. And it doesn't mean I'm necessarily right. Bearing in mind all those things, getting dogmatic is probably a flipping bad idea. It's easy to turn on each other under opposition that we just don't know what to do with. When the forces we're facing feel like this, like the Death Star, you know? The thing's the size of a planet, and there you are in your tiny little X-Wing fighters, you know? It's clearly impossible, but that doesn't mean you start firing at each other, because then you stand no chance. But we see it. We're seeing it now in LGBT communities, in faith communities. I'm seeing, you know, feminism dividing itself on whether or not people think it's okay to be trans or not. As though that had anything to do with the fact that women are treated unequally. And making it such an issue that they can't get on with anything else. We see it in denomination, including our own, sadly. Bickering ourselves apart when there is a much bigger problem out there that we could face effectively if we're willing to just forgive each other for being human. You see it in local churches all over the place, and in other groups and organisations. You see it in people with different kinds of poverty, where, to be honest, forces who do have power positively capitalise on turning, say, those who are in poverty but in work onto those who fled from wars and whatever other things elsewhere, when actually the problem isn't there, it's out there. And what we should be doing is working together. Matthew is picking the bits of Jesus' teaching to put together here, which show us how we can do that. By being patient. By being forgiving. By being willing to accept that we don't actually know who's right and who's wrong here and there. And also by being willing to work with people we disagree with, because we agree on the big picture, we agree on love, we agree that God loves all God's children and we are all God's children. We don't have to agree on who exactly is allowed to consecrate communion in our respective churches. We still agree that Jesus is at that table and is there for us. It's hard work. It's massively hard work. But Isaiah promised that Jesus would not break a bruised reed or quench a smouldering wick. Now sometimes I'm a bruised reed, other times your wick is smouldering pretty low. Sometimes our entire church or denomination or LGBT movement or whatever it might be feels like smouldering very low indeed, but Jesus isn't going to quench us. We might occasionally do our damnedest to quench ourselves. Jesus won't do it. Jesus is there, breathing on the flame. Come on. So we should probably be doing that for one another. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.